All right, well, welcome. It's my great honor to introduce Dwayne Oyler and Jenny Wu, co-founders of Oyler Wu Collaborative. Dwayne and Jenny are this year's Ruth Carter Stevenson Regents Chair in the Art of Architecture here at the University of Texas School of Austin School of Architecture. We are incredibly lucky to have them as visiting professors and welcome you to Austin. Jenny has been a friend of the school for some time. She gave a lecture here about 6 years ago, and in 2014 was an invited speaker as part of TextFab. The same year, she founded Lace, a 3D printed jewelry company, which has grown remarkably fast. The pieces have been featured in Forbes, People Magazine, Elle, and she was recently named one of 4 design visionaries by Porsche and was featured in Dwell Magazine's Powered by Design docuseries. Dwayne, I think this is your first time here at UT, maybe? First time since I've been here, so welcome. Looking forward to you both lecturing tonight, but also our interactions throughout the semester. Dwayne is an incredibly talented artist and builder, as well as designer. Before Oyler Wu, he collaborated with Lebbeus Woods, who this generation might not know as well as they should, but the work of Lebbeus is, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who had a bigger influence, especially on our generation, but also on architecture and the discipline, especially for someone who never built really much. The SF MoMA show and his work, by the way, Lebbeus Woods, is still the hands-down best show I've ever seen at any gallery. It was incredible. Both Dwayne and Jenny received their Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design and are currently on the faculty of SciArc, where they teach design studios. In 2021, they won the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture. In 2017, they won the Miller Prize, and in 2013, the Design Vanguard Award from Architectural Record. Their work has been published in pretty much every press and notable magazine you can think of, including the New York Times, Wallpaper, and others. Oyler Wu has been super active since their founding in the early 2000s, where they began making installations, and we're really an important part of a movement of architecture and architects that were testing ideas, technologies, and materials through installation work around that same time. Of course, the practice of making prototypes and mock-ups is not new to architecture, as we've been doing that forever. But I think that moment marked a shift from the prototype as an experiment or test of a larger architecture or a larger building to something that was actually independent of building altogether. And by decoupling these two, the installation from the building, the ideas became more clear and more precise and more disciplinary. They became manifestos because you could remove from all the stuff that's included in building, like program, egress, enclosure, even clients, and then really focus on an idea. And these ideas then became so perfected at the smaller scale that as firms like Oyler Wu started working on buildings, you can see how the work, these ideas directly inform, clarify, and make the larger work even more potent. And even though the work is increasing in scale and they are working on larger and larger buildings, they do continue to design and build the smaller projects. And you can see now, though, even though the projects at the various scales are independent from one another, their whole body of work has a consistency where they're all kind of singing in harmony with each other. It's a place that few architects are able to get to in their careers, and it's really exciting to see. With that, please join me in welcoming Dwayne Oyler and Jenny Wu.
No, that's fine. So I'm going to start out talking. We're going to tag team tonight. I'm going to be the more serious one, and Jenny's going to tell better stories. I guess that makes me the Abbott or the Costello. And I'm going to need glasses for that. First off, thank you for that introduction. And thank you for having us here this semester. Also, thank you, Corey, thank you, Paul, thank you to our students. I want to start out by talking a little bit about kind of who we are and the way that we work. At our core, we're obsessive designers and makers. We make things. We make drawings, and we make models. We make fabrications and we make strange objects. Most importantly, at least to us, we make buildings. Our belief is that life is elevated by the things that surround us. And we believe that our greatest contribution as architects and designers is to provide a sense of wonder and a sense of curiosity and intellectual engagement to people through the things that we make. The work that we do in our office, it varies really radically in scale, from towers to tables, from pavilions to pods, from the infrastructural to the intimate, and from tree houses to tricycles. We believe that every way that we can work, it brings a different set of criteria for evaluating the work that's at play, be it the spatial or structural aspects of a physical model, the precision and optimization possible through digital work, the materiality possible in a prototype, or the instantaneous ability of a hand sketch to convey intuitive ideas almost instantaneously. We hope to be seen as an office that exists in a space somewhere in between the many camps that today's world produces, kind of equal parts digital office, part shop guys, part academics, part fabricators, part inventors, part designers. I could keep going. We draw every day. It remains for us the most effective and immediate way for us to communicate. And while we still draw in conventional ways, our ways of drawing and communicating have adapted and evolved over the years. We've been exploring new ways of communicating and drawing in animated form. It's a form that's become especially useful as we've had more and more projects that we're doing overseas. So this is an example on the right of the way we have replaced some construction documents and assembly drawings with animations in order to communicate with our Chinese counterparts. The one on the left is a project in Indiana that Jenny will talk a little bit about later. Model making remains central to the way we develop the work. And this is especially true with regard to the intangible effects of light on a surface, or the material qualities that are so difficult to replicate quickly in digital form. At the core of our practice has been the belief that operating in the physical world is where we have the greatest impact. And we've tried to use this love of making as a way to kind of put things out there and to test them against the pressures of the real world. We started out making projects ourselves really out of necessity. And in the early days of the practice, we didn't really have budgets to get the work built by contractors. So our approach was simply to say, we'll figure out how to learn these skills. We didn't go into practice knowing them. But with every project, we learned a little bit more and more how to do it, and eventually they grew into what are passable skills at this point. We thought that we'd outgrow this hands-on work. We really saw it as a means to an end. But at a certain point, we decided that building all of this work ourselves wasn't quite the right path. Although we're still insistent on making some things, just not at this scale. Essentially, we've come to kind of realize that few things are as rewarding as moving an idea from concept into the physical world. Their material qualities, their tendencies to resist what you want them to do, the struggle that the real world development, often economics, brings it's essential to that sense of reward. We're an office that quite honestly really loves what we do. We've used every extra minute of our adult lives to kind of shape the way that the work surrounds us. Cliched or not, the culture of the office it's very much a family that shares that ethos. We live and work in the same space, and our own kids and their toys that you're seeing here are an essential part of that experience. And interesting things happened over the last couple of years with a number of our projects. They've, for various reasons, been finding second lives, partially, in at least a couple of cases, because they were temporary installations. But in other cases, leases were lost and things have been moved. This is a project that was originally built in a Hollywood space on Melrose, and 5 years later, they called us and said they had lost their lease and they had no place to put the component of the project that we had built, and asked if we had ideas for it. We did, and we eventually went and got the piece, or at least part of the project, the guardrail, brought it to our office, and used it to renovate our own office. And to do that, we used a technology called Fologram, which is essentially an augmented reality software that uses Microsoft HoloLenses as a way to superimpose a digital model onto a real-life environment. This allows for the placement of elements into highly complex, highly geometric environments without the need for drawings or even dimensional information. So you'll see in this video I'll show that we're essentially wearing these goggles and seeing the piece in space as we fabricate it. For the last 10 years, the way Jenny and I have talked about the work is to think about it through the lens of three overarching categories: line, surface, and volume. What has perhaps been most interesting about those ideas has been both the evolution that led to them, as well as the relationship that each have to the other. And in order to talk about it, I want to kind of give a brief overview about each of them. Many of the projects, many of our first projects involved a series of projects that were made up almost entirely of this kind of line work. And it grew out of a common interest between us. And the projects, they really started out as kind of doodles, and they grew into serious things that we were mining for spatial ideas and for a set of principles that guided the way we evaluated the architectural work that we were doing. We've always been interested in the idea of fully immersive spaces and interconnectivity. These drawings and the projects that grew out of them, they draw on this idea of density and issues of perception. They have a way of keeping your eye moving as you instantaneously shift between foreground and background, for example. The drawings were highly complex and often unrestrained in their formal and organizational systems, at times exploring sectional qualities, and often walking a fine line between a sense of spatial order and a kind of formal disarray. As they translated into architectural projects, other factors kind of came to bear on the work, namely the question of making and materiality. We built nearly all of this early work ourselves, mostly in the hot, disgusting, and dirty back parking lot of SciArc. Excuse me. The material of the work and its behavior, and especially its limitations, led to a formal sensibility that remain in so much of the work today. If I could point to a single factor that led to our formal and aesthetic sensibility today, it might be the regulated curvatures that came out of these early projects as we moved from cut sharp corners of aluminum to those that were bent and created more fluid fields in space. These kinds of projects allowed us to experiment with perceptual ideas and ways of thinking about the body's relationship to the work. We were often incorporating different scales of furniture-like elements into the work. It also gave us ways to study ways of thinking about sort of deep spatial experience, the kind that are seen in the earlier drawings. As the work has become more architectural, we've worked at ways of incorporating ideas of surface into the work. It forced us to think about how to simultaneously highlight ideas of linearity and structural systems while creating surfaces and panelization. And rather than relying on the default system of infilling or lofting between those lines, which is the more typical or kind of default way of thinking about their relationship, with these projects you'll notice that there's a much more loose-fit relationship between the two systems. At times they're in sync with one another, but at other times these lines they stray from one another. Their relationship between another is relatively loose. At times they become independent and free of the other. As this translates to building strategies, you begin seeing those things working in tandem with one another. With this one, it's an office building, unbuilt, but one of our earliest projects that really incorporated both of them for a company called IAC. Many of those same ideas are now being explored in our new Kaohsiung Museum of Fine Art. And our volumetric studies, these started with a set of experiments that we've called active inlays. And this term, active inlay, the word inlay, it's typically used to define, to refer to a relatively thin surface-like material that's laid into another. But as we thought about that definition, so you see it in things like musical instruments or wood antiquities with often things like mother of pearl inlaid into the surface. But we like this idea that the definition doesn't necessarily rule out the idea that the inlaid element is deep and three-dimensional. It could, in fact, be a robust three-dimensional system within the host object. So these studies exploit the ambiguity of that definition. At times, they suggest a conventional inlay, as in the musical instruments or antiquities. They're two-dimensional and they're located only at the surface. And at other times, the loose-fit relationship to the object that they inhabit reveals a deep and three-dimensional object. They raise questions about the formal continuities as eccentric elements seem to pass through the larger object. And the surface manipulations, the product of the eccentric object, sort of, find its resting place. They're intended to produce a tension between the two. At times they fit precisely, and at other times they pass through the space more independently. So in this larger set of inlays, you now see a handful of wireframe objects that reveal that ambiguity. I think I have a better image that reveals that. So in the upper left, you see the two white objects passing through the objects, both with the formal suggestion that they move through the object. But in reality, you can see revealed in the frame object that some of them truly do pass through, others of them are broken and only are suggestive of a continuity. And in this example of furniture, this kind of idea produces elements that at times seem to produce volumetric pieces, and at other times extends to reveal only a thin surface. Okay, so why does this matter architecturally? Well, as we move to buildings, this strategy it sets up a kind of expectation about the relationship between parts, both spatially and formally. Essentially, we can produce a sense of curiosity about the two-dimensionality of a facade by revealing certain three-dimensional curiosities. It raises questions like, how deep is that thing? What is it linked to? Is it suggestive of programmatic continuity, or is it only the suggestion of it? Essentially, we're interested in this idea of connectivity, but we believe that at times just charging it with the expectation that it might be true continuity is actually the more powerful effect. And in this case, which is for an office building in LA, the space is linked three-dimensionally to an interior lobby. But one of the points we want to make here again is that the tension produced by the suggestion of continuity is equally as powerful as true continuity and becomes a pretty fruitful tool for thinking about the design of architectural effects, even when continuity isn't possible. One of the issues that's resonated through all of the work has been a really intense interest in the relationship between parts. Well, this has been, let me turn this down a bit. Although the sound of the clicking and sliding is quite mesmerizing. So this has been, it's been apparent in the relationship of line to surface to volume, this relationship, this interest in assembly. But our most recent studies, these puzzles, look closely at a set of volumetric relationships that are based on puzzle-like qualities. So we're showing a few of these that were built to demonstrate this kind of idea. A few things about puzzles. Puzzles are intentionally designed to delay your understanding of them. They require that you think about them and that there's a kind of cognitive engagement with their nuanced characteristics. In other words, they have to be studied closely in order to be understood, often revealing concealed or hidden relationships deep in their interior. The geometry is central to their function as well as their aesthetic. And that geometry is often propagated throughout the system in order to mask their true assembly, effectively conflating geometric patterning with assembly systems. Each of these studies looks at different forms of assembly. The previous slide looked at various forms of rotational assembly. This one on simple slides that require sequential movements. This one, a spiraling system, pulls from a number of principles found in the active inlays, slicing and revealing just enough to provoke a sense of curiosity about the inner workings and hints of the system at play. With many of the puzzles, the reveals and the negatives also suggest other potential forms of assembly. These negatives form a kind of tension between parts, a near fit that sometimes delivers and at other times only sets in motion further investigation by the user. Like the active inlays, we find the translation to architectural ideas really rich in possibility, particularly in terms of the perceptual understanding of architectural parts. While it might not be so unusual to discuss the assembly of a set of architectural details, one rarely discusses program as a complex three-dimensional assembly or the relationship of a building to a site as a kind of assembly. Our interest in this idea of puzzles is a relatively new one, and it's just beginning to find its way into the larger projects in the office. But one project that we just completed a few months ago was for a client that came to us and they asked for a set of Jack and Jill chairs, essentially two children's chairs that were going to be used for exhibition, not necessarily for daily use. And we saw this as a pretty amazing opportunity to build on that idea. So the idea is essentially they are exhibited as a kind of strange interlocked set of objects, barely discernible as a pair of chairs. But when pulled apart, their identity is quite clear. These, like most of the other projects, are fabricated in our own shop, in this case out of cherry and stainless steel. And this is really a scale we keep taking bigger things because we just can't help ourselves. But this would be a scale we would love to continue to work at alongside the larger projects. And we find that moving ideas between this scale and the larger scale is especially fruitful. We try things, we try them really quickly, and they come to bear on ideas we're talking about later in the day about a much larger project. A few details of those chairs. And one we just completed a couple of weeks ago for the same client who asked for a side table and a coffee table. So we combined the two to make things that can be combined or pulled apart and used separately. This same kind of thinking, let me see if I can turn that down. No. The same kind of thinking about the way things come together and the way that kind of thinking affects its aesthetic character is also seen in the jewelry. I tried turning it down, it won't turn down. There we go. Okay. I'll just let this play and then I'll talk. Okay, so that same kind of thinking is also, oh man, come on. I don't think there's sound on there. Okay. Okay. I think you got it. That same kind of thinking is also coming into play in the jewelry of Jenny's company, which she started. You know, she will be very modest about it. I don't think she'll talk about it tonight, but I wanted to at least point out that the work over the years has been quite amazing and evolving alongside the interest of the office. I'm going to turn it over to Jenny now.
Hello, this is on. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dwayne. So yeah, but one little plug is that the new bracelets is we've been experimenting with this new type of 3D printing technology, which combines 3D printing with CNC milling, and so we can get really precise pieces that can interlock precisely. So anyway, that bracelet is launching next week. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sort of two projects, and then we'll talk go deeper into 3 projects. So the first project I want to talk about is our project in Columbus, Indiana. I don't know how many of you have been to Columbus, Indiana. A few of you. If you didn't know that this is a place where it's full of incredible architecture, I think there's 7 buildings by 4 different Pritzker Prize winners, and something like 90 or so PA awards in a city for 40,000 people. We were one of the first groups that we were asked to design an installation next to a master's building, and ours was next to Aero-Saarinen Bank, the Irwin Union Bank. And our site, so here you see on the right is the bank with 9 round skylights, and adjacent to that on the left is a plaza with 3 drive-through canopies that serve the bank and some landscape areas. And you know, Saarinen was truly, I mean, it's really difficult to build something next to one of your favorite architects and also very famous. I think you might know his work from the Dulles Airport, the St. Louis Arch, and the TWA terminal. I think he produced a lot of projects as we thought about how to relate to his work regarding light, and also this kind of interesting way of defining the reading of structure. So if you imagine in the Dulles Airport, the structure of that column goes up to where it's supposed to meet the canopy. That's that point where the transfer of load is supposed to happen. It kind of disappear into this like halo of light. And his interiors often also have really beautiful filigree details that we really love. So, so our strategy for the project, we utilize the existing 3 canopies that were the drive-through canopies, and then we built sort of 2 L shapes around it, and one that's much more opaque and one much more open. And so you can see how we took the canopies and start to create these 2 walls. And, you know, with especially at that time, you know, we were trying to transition between projects that were mostly installation into sort of pseudo beginnings of buildings, and we want it to be something that you can really occupy. And with every project, we really think about, like, how do we, you know, work on not just the designs, but how do we work on fabrication techniques that we have never done before. So we've done a lot of frame-like elements, like the one on the right, but we've never done sort of fully welded 3-dimensional parts like the one on the left. So that was a challenge. And what was even more challenging is that you realize that there's not a single part that's actually square and rectangular. And so as we shipped to Columbus, we designed these crates that held each piece with rope. And then we packed 2 semi-trucks exactly perfectly with all of our installation pieces. So we actually also had to do a drawing of the semi-trucks, which was the most important. And, you know, after about, I don't know how long has Dwayne been welding, he gets very good at welding, you know, in uncomfortable places. And, you know, our kids think that they're working on the projects. And some final pieces, shots. You know, what was really incredible was that at the end, you know, some of the locals came to us and said, you know, what's great about this piece is that it feels like it's always been there, but it's totally new. And I thought that was one of the best compliments we could get. So, um, you know, after doing about 10 years of installations, one of the hardest things is when, it's supposed to be temporary, and Dwayne had mentioned, and then, at certain time they tell you you got to, move it or, recycle it. And, it's always very heartbreaking. And so over the years, we figured out ways of giving second lives to all of our installations. And sometimes we always build it. We always build it so that they can have second lives. And so, as the plaza had to be given back to their kind of capital plans and etc., and we were asked to move the pavilion, and which was one not easy because it was built to those canopies. And if you imagine those canopies over time, nothing was actually quite straight. So it was like built to that tolerance. And so, these are all a lot of tricky things that we had to work with. But we were able to find a buyer in Taiwan to take this. So during the pandemic, it shipped across the ocean, and our client would like to, they want to repurpose it as a kind of event space. So you can see how we reconfigure the installation to become a kind of interior space, a portion of it. And then behind it is going to be a very fun, we got to design a basketball court as well. So you can see that the left side is the original installation, then we added on to it. And then behind it is the basketball court, which was also fun because we've never done a basketball court. And, we were, trying to mix both what the size of what they can print and what is, and, some of the regulations of basketball, etc. So it became a really fun kind of graphic project. And this, we hope that it will be built next year. The second set of projects I'm going to talk about is our bigger building projects. And I think like 6 years ago, I started, and we had done one of the towers. I am personally from Taiwan. This is Taipei. And I remember started going there as a kid, and then thought, well, what if we try to do some work there? Didn't realize how challenging it was. And at that time when we first started, and this is a lot of our early proposals, we had only done installations. And so if you can imagine how you go from an installation to a big building, a line becomes a bigger pipe and a bigger pipe. And so, in some ways we think that it was good that we got to, none of these got built. It's a good experiment to understand how do you scale up when the biggest thing you've done is a canopy. And I think that was such a great learning experience that led to the actual project that was built. So the site is really interesting. It's next to elementary school, and then the other side is the elevated highway and across from a middle school. So we understood this project as one it's going to be very volumetric, will be understood. It's not an infill project. You'll be able to see the corners. And one kind of nice sort of story is I actually went to elementary school there for a couple years. And so we went into the project with all this excitement about like, our first big building. And, this is the sort of the image I like to show, where it's like, that's where we like the variation, but the chaos of what people do after they get a building, and then what is really normally built on the right, which is very cookie cutter. And so we really thought about how can we create a system that can kind of manifest some of the sort of the ad hoc creative movements from the city, as well as how things were built, and create things with variations that in fact that has variations, which surprisingly, or what I didn't understand was the first thing they said is, okay, here's your floor plan for your building, which you'll see in the middle doesn't change much. And then they tell you, okay, you got about 5 feet of space in front of your building, you got 2.5 feet of space in the side of your building, and then now make it feel like it's totally integrated. You're like, great. So we try to do, and also every column has to be on the outside because they want to maximize the sellable square footage on the interior. And then you somehow try to camouflage all of these kind of things that you see all over the city. So this is the final project was built in 2017. And you can see that we you really use a variety of materials, different techniques from line works to surfaces and creating different, especially in this where we start to wrap corners to create much more volumetric reading. And I still remember like the first time it was like a very rainy, you can sort of see the rain, and that they like built a mock-up of one of the balconies, and because they just never done anything at this scale that with such variations. And I thought that was pretty amazing. They even elevated it to show me like, and then they're like, to them, they've never like, what, you mean every panel's different? Like, how do we do that? And then, like, how do I sell a residence where this person's balcony is slightly different than the next one? And, like, you just have to kindly suggest that maybe you should sell differently. So this was, this being built on site. And this blue thing that's kind of all over the city, the scaffolding, until it's completely off, you couldn't see anything. And I remember the day when the scaffolding came off, and my friends in Taiwan like texting me like, "Oh my God, we see it!" And that was pretty exciting. I was just there a few weeks ago, and it's still looking pretty great, I thought. And so pretty excited that we get to work on a second version of this project. In the interior, we also were able to implement some fun things like this wall on the left for all the elevator lobbies. We also had some furniture pieces. I'm still going. So just to quickly show you a new project we're doing that's close by. This is the site. And unlike the other side, this is a even more strange kind of footprint. And not, we thought maybe we got away with more. We can get away a little bit more stuff, but it was still the same. You get like 2 feet here, 3 foot here, and then the corner, you can't do anything there. So, and what we really try to do was trying to think about how we can, use not before it was a more of a applied system. this was in a really nice area where there was a little bit more budget, and we were able to create these kind of modules that uses stone for the units. And then there were also areas where there were kind of air gaps and things like that that we added, added some of these kind of framework to start to tie different areas together. And so this is the final piece, and it's also dark, different color. And you can start to see the way the framework starts to stitch the balconies and the surface applications on to each other. So, and then to a few weeks ago, that's the mock-up they built. So it's kind of coming back around, which was pretty cool to see. And now it's funny, like whatever, 6 years later, they were like, "Oh, this is easy. We know how to do this, and let us show you." All right, Dwayne.
I want to say, before I move on, we just have one more project, but I wanted to say one more thing about the tower. Jenny always wanted to do big buildings, and in the beginning, I didn't. And it mostly had to do, and particularly towers, I didn't really want to do. And the reason I didn't was because I always thought they're not spatial. You might get a little lobby, but there's nothing spatial about them. And as we did the project, I don't think we thought about it so intently, but the thing that was most powerful about it in the end to me was when you go to the site and you're actually on the sidewalk and you look up at it, what you see is this sort of spatial field of planes of different densities. And it is really difficult to tell where the line of enclosure is. It moves in and out, and you're looking through multiple layers. And it sort of occurred to me like, God, it's spatial again. This is why this is a way that towers can interest us. And nicely, the difficulties we had to overcome with working with only small amounts of space, actually they couldn't become occupiable, they couldn't become enclosed, actually sort of served us well in that sense. About a year ago, we competed for the Cold War Veterans Memorial. It's located in a small town just north of Chicago called Summers, Wisconsin. And what's fascinating about the Cold War really is its overwhelming breadth and complexity. In many ways, the events that make up the Cold War, depending on when they occurred and for what generation, maybe one's geographic location, your political associations, all of these events, they tend to produce really different ways of understanding and interpreting its significance as a cultural force. Jenny and I, we grew up in very different parts of America. I'm from a tiny town north of Tulsa in Kansas. Jenny's from Los Angeles, beginning in Taipei. But in many ways, our experiences of the Cold War, they were pretty different. But there was this sense that the Cold War kind of loomed over us in our childhood years in particular. So while you could say there are a lot of common experiences that come to bear on that common negative experiences, there were also some interesting positive aspects of it. Technological innovation, for example, grew out of the Cold War. We somehow found collective strength as a country, or at least in this fight for democracy, or at least we found a common enemy that we could root for. So there was something that kind of bound us together culturally through this period. We spent a lot of our time thinking about finding a balance between the idea of an iconic memorial, meaning one that has a kind of singular and immediate impression, versus a more nuanced and multifaceted form of representation. Ultimately, we believe that a memorial, on one hand, it should have an initial impact as a kind of iconic element. But it should also embody a range of experiences that mirror the Cold War, particularly in this case, by using a mixture of organization, form, and material to evoke those moments. So our design process, it first looked at a range of iconic Cold War artifacts as a way to draw on the experiences. These included things like spy satellites and U-2 bombers. And we thought about these elements in terms of them being kind of lightweight and of the sky. They're kind of technological relics that spoke to the advancements of the time. And we felt that they have an enduring iconicity. But we also thought about a similar set of elements that evoke a very different spatial sensibility. Things like war rooms and fallout shelters. These are spaces, unlike those elements that are of the sky, these are deeply embedded in the earth, and they reflect a much more ominous sensibility. All of these, they represent an enduring impression and a feeling with spatial qualities that weigh quite heavily on the collective memory of the war. We also looked at underground bunkers, deep water submarines, spy planes, missile silos. We collected a huge library of these artifacts of the war. And they all existed in such sharp contrast to the exciting and innovative technologies that were advancing alongside them. But with the speed of technological advancement during this period, it produced aging relics that were almost obsolete within a matter of years. But having said that, our sense is that their iconic and their aesthetic presence has a pretty powerful reminder. What's also interesting about so many of these elements is that their imagery conjures paradoxical aesthetic and emotional responses. By that we mean they don't evoke a single emotion. And it would be impossible or foolish to try to produce that. They essentially stir a mix of emotions: fear, nostalgia, curiosity, wonder, and for many, a sense of pride and patriotism. So our proposal looked at that history. It used its imagery, its artifacts, and its iconic figures as the building blocks for our scheme. The intention is to draw on this influence and to bring these elements together to evoke a larger impression, effectively using them to create moments that would at times come into focus. You just begin to recognize something before it fades into a more abstracted whole. So in this aerial view, you see Summers Road, the primary road into town that leads to the Memorial Park Center, which is a building almost completed in the upper right of the image by Helmut Jahn, his last building. And our strategy, rather than placing the memorial in the ring, as was suggested or at least implied in the brief, our strategy was to place the memorial along the ring, making it much more a kind of part of the journey rather than something to be viewed from outside. The brief that they gave us, it organized the Cold War into what we felt were four relatively succinct categories: the economic, the military, and the intelligence. The intelligence and the diplomatic. And we thought that they pretty astutely bracketed the effects of the war, but we instantly recognized that there were sort of interesting overlaps between them. The relationship between each of those is complex, it's interconnected, and it's intertwined. So in developing the formal strategy so we began to associate each one of those categories with a ring. And the formal relationship between the rings, we wanted the concept to be more than just a flat set of rings laying on top of one another. We wanted to combine them in ways that are three-dimensional and sort of interlocking. It allowed for a more dynamic network of experiences that interlocked and kind of nestled into the landscape in unusual ways. On one hand, each of these, what we called orbits, maintains an individual identity in the memorial sequence, but at the same time, they're unified through a connective experience to the overall park. So in order to accomplish this, we relied really heavily on elevational changes throughout the site, maybe best demonstrated in the model and in the section. These elevational changes sort of go back to that idea that I was talking about of moments that are sort of lightweight and of the sky, and other moments that are deep and embedded. So the visitor experience essentially moves along a timeline in the site before encountering the set of intertwined rings. The most prominent element in the scheme is the large circular disc that's evocative of, well, you decide. The primary volume, it cracks open to create openings between the walls. And walking through these openings, curious details are intended to provoke a sense of wonder as they reveal the inner structure. Initial impressions they're often really different from those that are enduring. And our sense is that emotional responses, they resonate really differently than those that are more about acquiring knowledge. We weren't designing a museum here. At times, providing a more museum-like knowledge-based experience, it may even take away from the more evocative or emotional moments. So given those ideas, we've imagined the memorial kind of reveals itself in layers, essentially starting with that more abstract initial impression, moving through its details, its material qualities, and through subtle imagery that evoke each of the 4 categories. At the end of the day, we believe that's what is powerful is not to tell an incredibly detailed or encyclopedia version of the Cold War, but rather to kind of evoke a set of interpretations that ultimately resonate in really powerful but ultimately very diverse ways. Thank you very much.